Deep within the sealed archives of Henrico County lies a collection of papers that officials never intended you to see. Not family records, not tax ledgers, but testimonies, 33 in total, each describing deaths so grotesque, so methodically executed, that even hardened coroners refused to read them aloud. At the center of these forbidden files is one name that time itself tried to erase: Kate Bender, a woman who, in 1801, transformed Virginia's dark woods into a killing ground where escaped slaves became her quarry. For 18 relentless months, her reign of blood rewrote what it meant to be both hunter and monster. The year was 1801. The failed slave rebellion of Gabriel Prosser had left the region in chaos. Paranoia stalked every plantation corridor. Overseers slept with muskets beside their beds, convinced their world would ignite at any spark. But amidst this storm of fear, one figure emerged, not as protector of order, but as predator feeding on it: Kate Bender. Her presence carved silence wherever she walked. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, a giant of a woman with shoulders like stone and hands broad enough to bend iron. But it was her eyes, grey, unblinking, impossible to meet, that froze men in place. They did not look at you. They looked through you, as if weighing your very soul against some hidden scale. She was not born a Bender. She was Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell, raised in the tobacco fields where survival demanded cruelty. By the time she married overseer Thomas Bender, she had already forged herself into something cold, unyielding. And where most women of her time learned submission, Kate learned domination. Together, they ruled slaves with iron whips, their marriage forged in screams and broken bodies. But when her husband's blood spilled at the edge of a creek during a failed hunt for fugitives, something in Kate snapped. Grief did not consume her. Vengeance did, and vengeance sharpened into obsession. From that day forward, the woods were no longer a passage to freedom. They were her domain, and those desperate souls who dared to run north found themselves hunted, not by dogs, not by men, but by a woman whose thirst for cruelty had no limit. This is not folklore. This is forbidden history. And before we descend deeper into Kate Bender's world, I want you to anchor yourself here with us. Subscribe now, seal yourself into this circle of truth. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Type your city, your state, and then write this phrase twice to lock it into your identity. The veil is broken. The veil is broken. Because after tonight, you will never look at the past the same way again. Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell was not born into privilege, nor even into stability. She came screaming into this world in 1765 in the Piedmont region of Virginia to a family of tenant farmers who owned nothing but their labor. Her earliest memories were of tobacco dust choking her lungs, of hands raw and blistered from endless planting, harvesting, and hauling. Childhood did not soften her. It sharpened her. Hunger was her tutor, hardship her scripture, every eviction, every beating at the hands of overseers, carved into her a belief that strength alone preserved survival. By adolescence, Catherine was already known for her violence. She did not cry when struck. She struck back. Older boys learned to fear her fists, and grown men whispered that something inside her was unnatural. A local doctor, years later, would write that her body seemed built not for nurturing, but for endurance. Her bones thick, her muscles more akin to a draft horse than a young woman. She could snap walnuts between her fingers. She could bend iron with effort, and her stare, cold, grey, and unrelenting, made others look away before words could even leave their lips. When she married Thomas Bender in 1789, people understood the union for what it was: a marriage of cruelty. Thomas was an overseer notorious even among his peers for sadism. His whip was lined with metal studs. His punishments were designed not merely to break bodies, but to hollow out souls. And yet, while other women might recoil in horror, Catherine, now Katie, watched with fascination. She absorbed every detail of his methods: how fear could be nurtured like a crop, how despair could be cultivated until it rooted deeper than pain. Neighbors recalled nights where screams carried across the fields, followed by crashes of furniture as Kate and Thomas fought with the same violence they inflicted on others. But through it all, their bond endured, not out of love, but recognition. Each saw in the other a mirror: brutality without remorse, hunger without end. By 1800, the Bender plantation had become synonymous with terror. Whispers spread among the enslaved about Kate's eyes following them even in silence, about her pleasure in tearing families apart, about her eagerness to join the nighttime patrols that scoured the forests for runaways. For Kate, these patrols were not duty, they were rehearsal. She was no longer merely the overseer's wife. She was a predator waiting for her moment. That moment would come when death, sudden and brutal, tore her husband from her and unlocked the horror sleeping inside her. October 15, 1800, a grey dawn bled across Henrico County, the forests dripping with mist, the air sharp with the scent of rotting leaves. Thomas Bender awoke to word carried by trembling informants: 7 fugitives, 5 men, 2 women, had slipped through the night and were following the river north toward the Free States. For Thomas, this was opportunity. For Kate, it was revelation. The hunting party assembled before sunrise. Thomas, flanked by 2 fellow overseers and 4 dogs bred to tear human flesh, prepared for the chase. At his side stood Kate, armed with a club of oak so heavy that few men could swing it with one hand. Thomas had resisted her joining, claiming that hunting slaves was a man's work. But Kate's insistence was iron. She would not be denied. Her pale eyes gleamed with something even Thomas could not name. The chase carried them deep into the forest. Broken branches, footprints in mud, scraps of cloth snagged on brambles, signs of desperate flight. By midday the dogs howled with frenzy. The fugitives were close, resting by a creek, unaware that death crept toward them on silent feet. What followed was chaos. Thomas cracked his studded whip across the face of their leader, a preacher named Joshua, splitting skin to bone. The others surged forward in fury, while the women and the youngest fled into the woods. Blows, screams, splashing water. In the confusion, Thomas pursued 2 men toward the creek's edge. Moments later, silence was broken by the dull sound of skull meeting stone. When the overseers reached the bank, Thomas Bender lay face down in the shallows, his skull caved in, the creek running red. Kate was kneeling beside him, her massive hands hovering just above his ruined head. Witnesses swore they saw no grief in her face, only a strange stillness, something that felt colder than mourning, darker than rage. The official records claimed that 2 fugitives killed Thomas with rocks before vanishing into the forest. But Kate's private journal, scrawled in jagged lines, told another version, that she had watched, frozen, as the men destroyed him. Yet the witnesses could never shake suspicion. Had she been frozen? Or had she been complicit? At the funeral, overseers demanded harsher patrols, louder whips, bloodier punishments. Kate sat in silence, eyes hollow, her body motionless as Thomas was lowered into the ground. But inside her, something had already been born. The overseer's death did not break her, it baptized her. After Thomas's burial, the plantation expected Kate to wither. Widows in those days were meant to retreat into mourning, to drape themselves in black, to cry at church pews until the community folded them back into safety. But Kate Bender did not mourn. She disappeared. For weeks she was not seen in the fields, nor at Sunday sermons. At night, her cabin windows glowed with lamplight until dawn, as if she were carving something in secret. Neighbors whispered that she had gone mad. Some claimed they heard guttural chanting drifting from her cabin in the small hours. Others said she walked the woods barefoot, dragging her fingertips through the soil as if reading messages in the earth. What no one knew, what only Kate's surviving papers reveal, is that she had begun keeping maps. Pages of hand-sketched diagrams of rivers, creeks, and deer paths. But the maps were not for hunting game, they were for hunting people. Every possible escape route north was drawn, marked, memorized. The death of her husband had stripped away the last thread binding her to restraint. Without Thomas, Kate no longer needed to act through another's authority. She was free to obey her own appetite. The forest was no longer wilderness. It was her cage of shadows, and she intended to fill it with prey. The first to vanish was a boy named Isaac, 14 years old, who had fled the tobacco fields with his mother. Witnesses said Kate tracked them alone, without dogs, moving in silence like some immense specter. Isaac's body was discovered 3 days later at the edge of a cornfield, broken, his neck twisted at an angle so clean it seemed surgical. His mother was never found. The county record listed it as punishment in flight, but those who examined Isaac's corpse reported something peculiar. His bones were shattered, not by tools, not by whips, but by hands, enormous hands. Word spread swiftly through the enslaved quarters. Kate was no longer merely a hunter, She was a demon in flesh, a giantess who stalked the night and crushed the living with her bare strength. And unlike Thomas, she killed not for discipline, nor even profit. She killed for the silence that followed. By the winter of 1801, the woods themselves had grown strange. No birds sang when Kate entered, no dogs barked when she passed. The air, they said, seemed heavier, darker, when her figure appeared between the trees. Her transformation was complete. The overseer's widow was gone. In her place, a legend had been born. By the spring of 1801, the name Kate Bender had become more than a whisper. It was a warning. Runaways carried it north in terrified breath. Overseers muttered it over whiskey, and even planters, men who believed themselves masters of all things, spoke it with unease. For 18 relentless months, she ruled the woods of Henrico like a sovereign of blood, and every fugitive who dared step into those trees knew one truth: if Kate found you, death would not come cleanly. Her methods were not random. Each kill bore her signature. First came the chase. She moved silently, never relying on dogs, as if contemptuous of lesser predators. Her knowledge of the terrain was absolute. Every deer trail, every crossing stone, every hollow where mist gathered at dawn. She drove her quarry not with noise but with presence. Survivors, few though they were, described the same horror, the feeling of being watched, not from behind, but from everywhere at once. Then came the capture. Kate did not strike like a soldier. She struck like nature itself, sudden, overwhelming, merciless. Her immense hands could lift a grown man from the ground, her grip strong enough to collapse a windpipe in seconds. Others she subdued with her oak club, a weapon so massive that even hardened hunters struggled to raise it. When Kate swung, bones snapped like twigs, skulls split with a sound too dreadful to describe. But the cruelty did not end with the capture. She was inventive. Witnesses who found her victims, those rare enough to be recovered, spoke of bodies arranged deliberately. One man was nailed upright to a tree, his arms spread wide, as though mocked in crucifixion. Another was buried waist deep in soil, left for wild animals to finish. A woman was discovered bound with hemp rope, her eyes gouged, her tongue cut away. Kate did not merely kill. She staged fear itself as theater. The county kept official numbers vague, though private testimonies whispered 33 confirmed deaths. Some claimed the tally was higher, closer to 50, souls swallowed by Kate's forest. Each disappearance fed her legend, each mutilation deepened her myth, and yet through it all, she never spoke of vengeance, never spoke of grief. To those who saw her, Kate appeared serene, as though her acts were not crimes but rituals, not murder, fulfillment. The forest had found its monster. And for 18 months Virginia lived in her shadow. By midsummer of 1801, Henrico County was unraveling. Fear seeped into every corridor of power, gnawed at every hearth, and slithered through the woods where Kate moved unseen. Slave patrols, once smug and careless, now doubled in size, their muskets clutched tighter, their torches burning longer into the night. But even in groups, even armed, there was no courage left in them. They marched in silence, eyes darting into the trees, half expecting the giantess to step into their path at any moment. Overseers, once drunk on their own authority, now whispered privately of betrayal. How could one woman cripple their order so completely? Some accused neighbors of aiding her. Others swore Kate was no longer flesh at all, that she had bargained with something in the woods, some black spirit older than the colony itself. They pointed to the way animals grew silent when she passed, the way fires guttered in her presence, the way her grey eyes seemed to glow in moonlight. Among the enslaved, Kate's name twisted into legend. For some, she was terror incarnate, the punisher who crushed children and tore families apart. For others, she was judgment itself, a dark saint of retribution who turned the overseer's tools against his own kind. Songs were whispered in fields about the woman in grey eyes, half prayer, half curse, a reminder that no chain was free from consequence. And yet, despite the horror, no one confronted her directly. County officials issued proclamations, urged vigilance, demanded that citizens act. But in truth, no one wished to meet her gaze. The patrols searched for runaways, not for Kate. Planters held councils on protection, but none volunteered to hunt her down. It was as if she had ascended beyond the reach of law, beyond even fear itself. Night after night, her pattern continued. Groups vanished, tracks ended at streams, corpses reappeared in grotesque tablocks. Each discovery deepened the paralysis of the county, and with every soul she crushed, her power grew, not in the sense of armies or riches, but in the raw currency of dread. Kate had become more than a widow, more than a woman. She was an institution of fear, carved into the land itself. By the year's end, people no longer asked who Kate Bender was. They asked something darker. They asked, what was she? The winter of 1801 descended harsh and unrelenting. Snow blanketed the fields, ice glazed the creeks, and the sky seemed locked in permanent grey. Hunger gnawed at both slave and master. Yet even in this season of scarcity, Kate Bender's shadow did not fade. It grew sharper, colder, as though the frozen landscape suited her better than sunlight ever had. Her killings, once brutal but swift, began to change. They became deliberate, ritualistic. Bodies were no longer discarded in haste, but arranged in ways that seemed designed to speak. One fugitive was found kneeling in snow, arms bound as though in prayer, his eyes frozen open, his tongue torn from his mouth. Another was suspended upside down from a tree branch, his blood staining the snow in a perfect circle beneath him. To onlookers it was horror. To Kate it was order. She had begun writing her creed in corpses. The overseers who examined these scenes whispered that no human hand could craft such tableaux. They suspected witchcraft, devilry, forces not of flesh but of the abyss. Fireside tales spread of Kate invoking spirits in the forest, of her walking barefoot through snow without leaving footprints, of her voice echoing in the trees, though she stood silent. Some claimed she had called upon Gabriel Prosser's failed rebellion not to mourn it, but to feed upon its chaos. Among the enslaved, the stories shifted again. Some called her a demon sent to punish the weak. Others, with trembling reverence, began to wonder if she was the hand of judgment itself, God's wrath cloaked in monstrous form. The songs that drifted from the cabins carried her name, half in terror, half in awe. Yet through it all, Kate remained unchanged. She wrote nothing beyond her crude maps. She spoke to no one, save the occasional curt words to traders who brought her supplies. Those who glimpsed her in winter swore she seemed larger than ever, her frame wrapped in furs, her eyes colder than the ice on the river. She did not flinch from the cold, she thrived in it. By February of 1802, Henrico County had become a place of paralysis. No fugitive dared the woods. No overseer entered them without trembling, and in the frozen silence Kate ruled alone. What began as vengeance had transformed into something darker, a theatre of cruelty, a doctrine of terror carved in snow and blood. By the spring thaw of 1802, Henrico County was no longer governed by magistrates or planters. It was governed by silence. The silence Kate Bender imposed with every corpse left in the woods. Her terror had outgrown the bodies she crushed. It now seeped into the minds of those who claimed to rule. Planters began to argue in hushed tones at council meetings, their wealth bleeding away as labor fled or froze in fear. Tobacco rotted unharvested in the fields. Cotton bales lay unsent to market. Overseers who once carried themselves with arrogance now slept in shifts, their muskets never more than an arm's reach away. They no longer feared rebellion from below. They feared a single woman above them, moving like a phantom across their borders. County officials met to discuss solutions, but their words betrayed desperation. Who among them would ride into the woods and face her? They spoke of militias, of trapping parties, of bringing in soldiers from Richmond, but none volunteered to lead. When Kate's name was spoken aloud in those chambers, the air thickened. Men who commanded hundreds of lives suddenly found themselves afraid to speak above a whisper. Even commerce withered. Traders avoided the roads near her domain. Mail went missing. Taverns emptied earlier. And in the enslaved quarters, Kate's legend took root in ways no overseer could control. Stories spread of her as the Grey Widow, a spirit who answered cruelty with cruelty, who could not be killed by bullet or blade. Mothers frightened children into obedience by warning that Kate would come for them. At the same time, whispered prayers invoked her as a dark protector, proof that even the most powerful could be made to tremble. Everywhere she was contradiction, demon and saint, curse and prophecy, and with each retelling, her reach extended farther than her hands could ever grasp. The county had intended to erase Gabriel Prosser's failed rebellion from memory, to restore control through fear. Yet Kate had stolen that fear and made it her own. She was no longer punishing runaways. She was punishing a system, warping its very psychology until men who once believed themselves invincible lay awake at night, staring at shadows on their walls. By summer, it was clear Kate was not simply killing, she was rewriting the order of Virginia itself. By midsummer of 1802, Kate's violence had taken on a new and disturbing precision. The randomness of her earliest kills, the frantic hunts, the brute force murders, had evolved into something structured, something ceremonial. Every disappearance followed a pattern. Every corpse told a message. It was no longer vengeance. It was doctrine. Victims were no longer merely slain. They were displayed. One man chained to a tree had his arms spread wide, his chest carved with lines that formed a crude symbol. Two intersecting circles, their meaning lost to time. Another was buried upright to his neck, his eyes gouged and replaced with stones, as if Kate meant to blind him in death. Entire groups vanished, and when their remains surfaced weeks later, they were laid side by side, perfectly aligned, their hands bound with the same length of rope, as though they had been measured. County officials tried to hide these details, labeling the deaths as fugitive resistance neutralized, but whispers outrun proclamations. The arrangement of bodies could not be dismissed as accident. Something was guiding her hand. In the quarters, some swore she had embraced the old African spirits, calling on gods of the dead she had witnessed slaves invoke in secret rituals. Others insisted she had struck a bargain with darker forces, trading her soul for strength beyond human limits. And still others, terrified and trembling, believed she was nothing more than herself, that a woman's will, unchained from conscience, could invent cruelties worse than demons. Whatever the truth, the results were undeniable. Kate had elevated murder into spectacle. Each tableau etched itself into memory. Each victim became another verse in the scripture she was writing across Henrico's soil. And like scripture, it demanded interpretation. Overseers argued whether the symbols were warnings or invitations. Planters debated whether she meant to terrify runaways or humiliate masters. The enslaved debated whether she was punisher, liberator, or something in between. In truth, it did not matter. Kate had mastered the most enduring weapon of all ambiguity. She left the living to puzzle over her intent while the dead lay cold at her feet. By late 1802, the woods of Henrico had become not only a place of terror but of ritual. Those who entered were not just risking death. They were stepping into a theater where Kate Bender played high priestess, and their bodies would be her scripture. By autumn of 1802, the terror Kate Bender sowed could no longer be contained within Henrico's borders. What began as a local nightmare now rippled outward, carried in whispers along trading routes, across tavern benches, and in the trembling voices of travelers who swore they had seen her pale figure at the edge of the trees. Kate was no longer merely a name in county records. She was a story retold in Richmond, in Petersburg, even as far as Williamsburg, always with the same shiver of dread. Slave patrols, once the backbone of plantation control, began to fracture. Men deserted their posts under the cover of night, slipping away rather than risk a brush with the Grey Widow. Those who remained patrolled in groups, so large that they were useless, too noisy to catch fugitives, too terrified to leave the main roads. Overseers, stripped of their aura of dominance, now lived with the same unease they once inflicted. They turned their paranoia inward, accusing one another of cowardice, treachery, even secret sympathy with Kate. County officials quarreled bitterly. Some argued for a military expedition, a cleansing fire to scour the woods and flush her out. Others insisted that acknowledging Kate too loudly would give her more power, that fear itself was her greatest weapon. Behind closed doors, it was admitted what none dared say aloud. Every attempt to catch her had failed. She moved like smoke, appearing where she wished, vanishing without trace. But it was among the enslaved that her myth bloomed most dangerously. For generations, terror had been used as a tool to enforce obedience. Now that tool was cracking. Songs once whispered only in corners spread openly through the fields. Songs of a woman who walked alone, unbroken, stronger than chains, stronger even than men. To masters, these verses were seditious. To the enslaved, they were prophecy. In every story retold, Kate grew taller, stronger, more unkillable. Muskets could not pierce her skin. Dogs refused to chase her scent. Some claimed she could vanish into mist. Others that her eyes glowed with fire when she struck. Whether these details were true did not matter. Fear and belief fused together until no distinction remained. By the year's end, Virginia stood divided. The courts clung to their proclamations, the people clung to their silence, and over it all, one figure loomed larger than law, larger than legend: Kate Bender, the widow who had bent a state to her shadow. In January of 1803, desperation forced Henrico officials into a decision they had long avoided. They would call in soldiers, not overseers, not slave patrols, but trained militia from Richmond itself. The hope was simple: steel and discipline would succeed where fear-ridden men had failed. 50 soldiers marched into the county, their uniforms stiff, their boots striking the frozen ground with the rhythm of order. They carried muskets, sabers, even a pair of hunting hounds bred for war. The planters gathered to watch them, relief flickering in their tired eyes. For once, there was hope that Kate's reign would end. But the forest had other intentions. On the first night, torches lit the patrol routes as soldiers spread through the trees. They sang to keep courage high, their voices clashing against the silence. But by morning, the singing had stopped. Only 39 men emerged from the woods. 11 had vanished without trace. The survivors told disjointed stories, of shadows moving faster than sight, of screams that came from nowhere, of muskets jamming powder refusing to spark as if the very air had turned against them. One man, pale and trembling, swore he saw her, Kate herself, standing motionless between the pines, her face unreadable, her eyes reflecting torchlight like a beast's. When he blinked, she was gone. The next night, the dogs refused to move. They whimpered, tails between their legs, eyes fixed on the darkness. Soldiers dragged them forward by chains, but the animals howled until their throats bled. When the handlers finally loosed them, the hounds bolted, not toward prey, but back toward camp, tearing through tents and scattering supplies. By the third night, morale collapsed. Men deserted under cover of darkness. Others refused to re-enter the trees. When the officers tried to enforce discipline, a mutiny erupted. Shots rang out, and 3 soldiers lay dead, killed not by Kate, but by their own comrades. Within a week, the militia abandoned Henrico. Officials, humiliated, buried the affair beneath layers of silence. No public report was filed. No proclamation declared victory. The soldiers left, and Kate remained. What was meant to be a display of power had become proof of impotence. Kate had not just survived the state's wrath. She had swallowed it whole, and in the silence that followed, her myth became unbreakable. By the spring of 1803, sightings of Kate Bender became less frequent, yet her presence grew heavier than ever. It was as though the woman had chosen to shed her skin, trading the solidity of flesh for the untouchable aura of myth. Farmers swore they saw her figure crossing the tree line at dusk, only to vanish when approached. Children whispered of her pale eyes glimmering between branches at night, like twin lanterns that never blinked. The killings did not stop. Bodies still surfaced along the river, dangling from trees or buried shallow in the mud. But now, no one could claim to have seen her strike. It was as though the forest itself obeyed her command, swallowing fugitives whole and spitting them back out as warnings. Even the bravest trackers refused to set foot near certain clearings, insisting that the air there stank of iron, that every bird ceased singing the moment one crossed an invisible line. Kate's journal, recovered decades later, confirms this transformation was deliberate. She wrote of her intent to withdraw into the folds of shadow, to become not a woman but a force. They cannot kill what they cannot touch, she scrawled, her handwriting jagged, letters gouged into the paper, as if she carved with fury rather than ink. She described herself as becoming the silence between breaths, and claimed the woods had chosen her as their executioner. Her enemies, both black and white, began speaking of her in terms once reserved for demons. Some called her the Grey Widow. Others whispered Henrico's phantom. Rumors reached as far as Pennsylvania, carried by both terrified fugitives and those who barely escaped her reach. Each retelling made her larger, less human, more monstrous. And therein lay her true power, psychological domination. For every actual kill, dozens abandoned their flights north, convinced that Kate would find them. Entire routes of the Underground Railroad shifted westward, avoiding Virginia altogether. In this way, she achieved what overseers and militias could not. She turned the idea of freedom itself into a haunted prospect, poisoned by her legend. By the year's end, Kate no longer needed to swing her oak club or tighten her rope with those colossal hands. Fear itself had become her weapon. She had crossed the threshold from murderer into myth, and myths are far harder to kill than flesh. For those who lived under the constant shadow of her legend, survival demanded more than strength of body. It required strength of spirit. Enslaved families began whispering stories not only of Kate's cruelty, but of ways to resist her reach. In the cabins and quarters, by firelight and under hushed breath, a secret folklore was born. They said salt, when scattered in a circle, could keep her pale eyes from crossing its boundary. They said iron nails hammered into a doorway would cause her shadow to falter. Mothers taught their children never to call her name aloud in the dark, for to speak it was to invite her. These rituals did not erase the danger, but they gave people a weapon, a fragile shield against the despair she cultivated. Some believed Kate could smell fear itself, that her senses sharpened on the terror of those fleeing. To counter this, fugitives carried bitter roots in their mouths, hoping the acrid taste would mask the scent of panic. Others sewed tiny leather pouches filled with hair, ash, and river stones, charms meant to confuse her path and turn her eyes elsewhere. These tokens became quiet acts of rebellion, proof that even against a monster made of flesh and myth, the human will sort ways to endure. In the hushed language of the quarters, songs were reshaped. What sounded to overseers like spiritual hymns carried coded pleas for protection, verses warning of the tall woman in the pines, refrains that asked for angels to blind her sight. These melodies passed secretly along escape routes, their rhythms carrying both warning and hope. But the deeper truth was this: Kate's presence forced the enslaved into a constant war, not just of survival but of belief. To succumb to terror was to be caught before the chase even began. To hold faith, even in salt, iron, or whispered hymns, was to deny her dominion over the soul. And though her killings scarred the landscape, it was in these small rituals that another story unfolded, a story of quiet defiance, of communities refusing to surrender the last sanctuary she sought to strip away, the sanctuary of the mind. Kate Bender hunted flesh, but spirit resisted her, and in that resistance, her myth took on another form, not just predator, but a test of will that shaped the very psychology of escape. While enslaved families whispered protective charms, another, colder calculus unfolded among the ruling class. White authorities, planters, patrol captains, even preachers, recognized something they could not admit openly. Kate Bender's legend served their interests. She was a monster, yes, but a useful one. Every story of her oak clubs splitting skulls, every tale of fugitives strung up like broken dolls, became a deterrent stronger than whips or chains. Overseers found that when whispers of Kate reached the quarters, fewer dared to run. Patrol leaders noted that her shadow did what their lanterns could not. It reached beyond fences, infecting the imagination with dread, and so a dark bargain took shape. Not in writing, but in silence. Authorities stopped speaking of her as a criminal. Court records thinned, patrol reports omitted her name. Instead, her legend was allowed to grow wild, unpruned, carried by rumor, inflated by fear. Planters told each other over bourbon that the woman in the woods had likely reduced their runaway losses by half. They did not thank her aloud, but their silence was its own form of approval. Even the churchmen found utility in her. From pulpits, they preached of Kate as an example of what happens when God's order is defied. Some called her a scourge sent to remind the enslaved of their place. Others painted her as a cautionary tale for white women, what becomes of the feminine spirit when it abandons obedience. These sermons blurred fact and myth until she was no longer simply a killer, but a living parable, twisted into service of the system she seemed to defy. But this manipulation came with consequences. The more her name spread, the more power it carried. Power beyond the grasp of those who thought they controlled it. Children of both races grew up with her story stitched into their nightmares. The line between reality and folklore blurred so deeply that even hardened patrolmen admitted to dreading her woods. In trying to wield her myth as a weapon, the authorities had fed a fire that could not be contained. Kate was no longer just a woman haunting Virginia. She was an institution of terror, a phantom allowed to roam free because her existence, half fact, half nightmare, kept the system running. And so, the silence of the powerful became complicity. Kate was not stopped because, in truth, they needed her. By 1805, the terror of Kate Bender was no longer confined to Henrico's pine woods. Her name traveled outward, carried by riverboats, stagecoaches, and the terrified mouths of those who claimed to have glimpsed her shadow. What began as a local horror became a national whisper, a story repeated in the smoky air of taverns and in the hushed corners of markets. Traders heading north told of the gray woman who hunts in Virginia. Some claimed she was 7 feet tall, others that she could run faster than a horse, her hands so strong she could strangle a man without breaking stride. The details shifted, but the core never changed. She was death in female form, roaming the wilderness unchecked. Fugitives who reached freedom carried her legend with them too, though in darker tones. In Pennsylvania and Ohio, stories circulated of men who had fled bondage only to be dragged back by the phantom of Henrico. Some abolitionist circles at first dismissed these tales as planter propaganda, but even among them unease grew. Could one woman truly stalk the rivers and woods with such precision? Was she flesh or something unholy, born of blood and forest shadows? In New York taverns, her story became a spectacle. Men told it with laughter, exaggerating her size until she rivaled giants of old. Yet beneath the laughter was unease. Why did so many travelers, from so many directions, repeat the same core warning? Why did their eyes dart toward the window when the wind howled? By the time Kate's name reached Boston, she had become a creature of folklore. Newspapers occasionally referenced her in brief, mocking lines. The Henrico Huntress, they called her. But even ridicule could not erase the shiver that ran through readers when they lingered too long on the thought of her. What no one could explain was how a single woman, armed with nothing more than rope, club, and will, could become a figure larger than death itself. Yet in every retelling, her legend gained weight, as if the world itself conspired to remember her. Kate had ceased to be just Virginia's terror. She was now America's nightmare, an untouchable phantom that no border, no mile of distance could keep away. By the end of the first decade of the 1800s, Kate Bender's shadow was no longer bound to whispers alone. She had crossed into culture. In the same way witches and specters haunted the old world, Kate became the New Republic's monster, stitched into stories that traveled farther than her footsteps ever could. Balladeers on dusty roads sang verses of the widow of Henrico, a song that told of a woman who stalked the woods by moonlight, her oak club echoing like a drum of doom. Children, pressed around fire pits, repeated refrains they half understood, their voices carrying fragments of her name into the night. Some songs painted her as a demon, others as a tragic woman betrayed by love, cursed to vengeance forever. The truth mattered little, the melody endured, carrying her forward. Traveling preachers seized upon her image too. In backwater churches they thundered of Kate as a warning. To enslaved audiences, she was held up as proof of what awaited the runaway who dared flee, God's appointed master. To white congregants, she was twisted into a sermon against disobedient women, a reminder of the chaos unleashed when feminine will escape control. Her violence became scripture for fear, hammered into hearts with every fiery sermon. But not all saw her as mere monster. Among the enslaved, stories of Kate sometimes bent in stranger directions. A few whispered that she was not wholly human but something conjured, born from the blood-soaked soil itself, raised by Virginia's forests as punishment for centuries of cruelty. To them, she was less a murderer than a sign that the land itself had turned hostile, rejecting the chains fastened upon it. Print, too, began to preserve her. Cheap broadsheets in port towns carried lurid accounts. The Henrico Huntress strikes again. Peddlers sold woodcut illustrations of a towering woman with wild hair and blazing eyes, rope coiled at her waist like a serpent. These images, crude yet powerful, etched her deeper into the nation's imagination. By 1810, Kate was no longer just a killer stalking backwoods trails. She had become folklore, a living ghost ballad, sung, preached and printed into permanence. And in folklore there is no death, there is only repetition. She had achieved what few mortals ever could say, she had become eternal. By 1812, Kate Bender's name was too large to ignore. Her killings had dwindled but her legend had swelled, and with it came a new breed of men, bounty hunters, sheriffs, and fortune seekers eager to carve their names into history by bringing her down. The rewards were whispered more than written. Planters pooling gold, merchants offering land, newspapers promising eternal fame to the man who captured the Huntress of Henrico. Each spring, fresh bands of armed riders thundered into Virginia's pine woods, certain they would succeed where soldiers and militias had failed. None returned whole. The first group, led by a sheriff from Caroline County, vanished entirely. Weeks later, their horses were found grazing wild, saddles empty, reins dragging in the mud. Not a single body was recovered. Locals said Kate had hung them so deep in the swamps that the earth itself swallowed them. The second band, hardened bounty hunters from North Carolina, fared worse. 3 were discovered days later, nailed upright to the trunks of trees like grotesque scarecrows, eyes pecked out by crows. The survivors limped back to town, babbling incoherently about traps strung between trees, of laughter echoing where no figure stood. They swore they had fired directly at her, but that their bullets passed through smoke. Even lone men tried their hand. One drifter from Kentucky boasted that he would bring her head in a sack. He was never seen again, save for a single item left at the edge of the forest, his sack, soaked red, filled with nothing but river stones. Each failure only tightened her grip on the American imagination. The more men who died chasing her, the more untouchable she became. To kill Kate would have been to end her story, but to fail against her was to fuel it. Soon, even the bravest bounty hunters turned elsewhere. The risk was too great, the forest too silent, the name too heavy to speak without a chill crawling the spine. Lawmen quietly erased her from their ledgers, not out of justice, but out of fear. By driving her hunters into the ground, Kate had ensured her survival. She remained free, unbroken, her woods inviolate. And each failed pursuit did not diminish her, it made her immortal. By 1815, the killing slowed, then ceased. No bodies appeared in the river. No fugitives vanished on the trail. No patrols stumbled out of the woods babbling of a pale-eyed woman in the dark. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Henrico knew silence. But silence was not peace. The sudden absence of Kate Bender only sharpened the mystery. Some swore she had finally died, felled by age, disease, or a hidden bullet. Yet no grave was ever marked, no corpse discovered. Others believed she had simply slipped north, her legend covering her retreat. If so, she vanished with the precision of smoke in wind, leaving not a single track. And then there were those who whispered something darker. They claimed Kate had not died at all, but transformed, that she had crossed some threshold where flesh dissolves and shadow remains. Enslaved storytellers insisted she had been claimed by the forest itself, her body sinking into root and soil, her spirit rising to stalk the trees forever. White planters, in turn, muttered that she had fled into the mountains, where she would sleep until summoned by unrest. Her journal offers no clarity. The entries grow jagged, frantic, then stop abruptly in mid-sentence. The final line, scrawled in ink so heavy it tore the page, reads only, "I will not be caged." After that, nothing. No signature, no date. A silence that mirrors her vanishing. Yet her absence did not erase her. It multiplied her. In every county where a runaway was rumored to have vanished, her name was invoked. Whenever a patrol failed to catch its quarry, she was blamed. When children went missing in the woods, parents hissed her legend to explain the loss. She had become untethered from her body, living instead in the imagination of a nation. To some, Kate was a cautionary tale. To others, she was a monster still lurking just out of sight. And to a small, fearful few, she was proof that evil never truly dies. It only waits. The woman was gone. The phantom remained. And in that absence, in that void, Kate Bender became more eternal than her living hands could ever have achieved. Time should have buried Kate Bender. Yet the decades that followed only sharpened her outline. When war came to Virginia in the 1860s, soldiers, Union and Confederate alike, entered the same woods she had once patrolled. Many did not leave with their courage intact. Union regiments marching through Henrico wrote of eerie silences, as if the forest itself had swallowed sound. Men swore they glimpsed a towering woman between the trees, her face pale, her hands gripping something long and heavy. Muskets were raised, shots fired into the dark, but nothing ever fell. One officer dismissed it as hysteria until he himself reported a dream of a woman tightening a rope around his throat. Confederate deserters told darker tales. Hiding in swamps to avoid conscription, they claimed a figure stalked them at night, dragging men from their camps one by one. The bodies, when found, were strung from branches in ways that mirrored Kate's old executions. Officially, such deaths were blamed on bandits or rival deserters, but in whispers, soldiers knew the truth. The Huntress had returned to her woods. Even after the war, during Reconstruction, travelers spoke of her. Carpetbaggers riding the riverboats muttered of hearing laughter drift across the water, low and mocking. Freedmen walking the roads swore her shadow trailed them, long and impossibly thin, stretching across the dirt even when no moon shone. By then, no one could claim she was alive. Too much time had passed. If Kate had been a woman of flesh, she would have been grey, feeble, perhaps dead in a grave no one marked. And yet the sightings came, consistent, unshakable. Historians later suggested these visions were born of trauma, that the horrors of war and bondage found shape in her legend. Perhaps soldiers projected their fear onto a phantom that already haunted the land. Perhaps freedmen, scarred by generations of terror, gave her name to every shiver in the woods. But what matters is not the explanation. What matters is the persistence. Decades after her disappearance, Kate Bender had not weakened. She had evolved. She was no longer merely a murderer from the early republic. She had become a revenant, a ghost that marched alongside the nation into its bloodiest era. And in this form, she proved what her enemies had long feared. Kate Bender would never die. 2 centuries have passed since Kate Bender's trail went cold, yet her shadow has not lifted. In Virginia, her name still clings to the soil. Hunters claim certain groves are cursed, their dogs whimpering and refusing to enter. Old families in Henrico pass down warnings: don't walk the pines at night, don't whistle past the river. They do not say her name aloud, but everyone knows who they mean. Ghost hunters arrive with cameras and recorders, chasing her as though she were just another spectral curiosity. Some leave laughing, but others swear their devices captured whispers. Low, guttural sounds like rope tightening under strain. One team reported finding a noose swaying from a branch, though no wind stirred the leaves. Academics have tried to dissect her. Historians debate whether Kate was a single woman or a composite myth stitched from runaway patrols, planter propaganda, and the terrors of a slave-holding South. Psychologists call her the embodiment of generational trauma, fear given flesh in memory. Folklorists point to how her story spread like wildfire, evolving with each retelling, becoming less about who she was and more about what she represented. But the locals need no theories. For them, Kate Bender was real. Too many bodies were found. Too many patrols never returned. Too many families lost fathers, sons, and brothers to the woods she claimed. Whether she still walks among the pines is irrelevant. She has already won. Because Kate achieved what most killers never could, she transcended death. She became both weapon and warning, both story and silence. She lived not just in the terror she inflicted, but in the imagination she conquered. And in that imagination, she has never loosened her grip. Perhaps she was a woman, a runaway's betrayer, a zealot, a hunter of men. Perhaps she was more, something the forest itself conjured to keep its secrets buried. Or perhaps she was both, flesh sharpened into myth until the distinction no longer mattered. Stand at the edge of Henrico's woods on a moonless night, and you will understand. The silence feels heavier there. The air tastes of iron. And if you listen long enough, you may hear it too, the faint creak of rope, the low hum of a woman's voice, carrying across 200 years. Kate Bender is gone, and yet she remains.